The argument I'm going to make today is that the rise of black ghettos in the early 1900s and the war on drugs in the 1970s continued the legal oppression of African Americans, resulting in their deliberate segregation from society and overrepresentation in U.S. prisons today. Black ghettos didn't rise by chance but through the law. In the early 1900s, African Americans began to migrate from the south to the north due to the industrial boom that was occurring in many northern cities. Whites didn't want to live in the same neighborhoods as blacks, but municipally mandated racial zoning was made unconstitutional by the 1917 Supreme Court case ruling in Buchanan v. Worley. To get around this, white private property owners began the practice of restrictive covenants, which is when property owners agree not to sell or rent their homes to certain minorities, in this case African Americans. These white private property owners signed contracts binding each other to that agreement. The 1926 Supreme Court case Corrigan v. Buckley affirmed the legality of restrictive covenants since it was between private parties and not the government. This forced African Americans to find housing elsewhere, usually in poorer neighborhoods. By the 1940s, 85% of housing in Detroit and 80% of housing in Chicago was under restrictive covenants. This is how many black ghettos rose in northern cities. African Americans were forced to find housing in usually crowded neighborhoods that were underfunded. Restrictive covenants finally was made unconstitutional by the 1948 Supreme Court case Shelley v. Kramer, but the damage had already been done. Whites were legally given the power to choose where African Americans could live, continuing the oppression of African Americans through the 1900s. The rise of the war on drugs in the 1970s was another instrument through which African Americans were oppressed. In 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs by increasing the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed for harsher sentences. Presidents after Nixon continued the war on drugs, and on the surface this seems fine, but there were other motivations behind Nixon's war on drugs. A top Nixon aide, John Ehrlichman, later admitted, quote, "You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. Drug use rates in black ghettos were comparable to drug use rates in white neighborhoods. And in New York, marijuana use in Columbia University dorms was the same as in neighboring black ghettos, but it was still African Americans who were being arrested in very high numbers. This resulted in mass incarcerations of African Americans and longer sentences, leading to an overrepresentation in U.S. prisons. The oppression and segregation of African Americans in the 1900s was a two-step process. 1. Black ghettos basically corralled African Americans into certain neighborhoods so that their living locations were known. 2. The war on drugs, although having some good intentions, was a way to lock up African Americans in high numbers and more permanently separated them from society. In conclusion, the rise of black ghettos in the early 1900s and the war on drugs in the 1970s continued the legal oppression of African Americans, resulting in their deliberate segregation from society and overrepresentation in U.S. prisons.